YouTubers, this is Marina from Frocks Frolics, and I'm going to show you how to sew a bias cut top. Many people are really scared of working something on the bias. That's why you hardly find any sewing patterns out there with dresses on the bias or tops. And this is why I thought, no, I'm going to do this. We have tried and tested and tested and tested more, from the length of the binding to the actual shape, and I think we've got a super product here. This pattern is going to be everyone's go-to. It really is fabulous, even if I do say so myself. Link is of course in the video description and up there as well under the info button, so that you can get this great top for yourself. You can make this like a pajama top with some boxer shorts. You can make it as an evening top. You have got all the possibilities there, and I think you're really going to love this. Now, there's a whole sewing course where you're going to learn how to do it either lined or unlined with bias binding. And this is the shorter version of it, of course, and I hope that you learn a lot. Anyway, this is so great, and I can't wait to show you how this all works. So let's get started with a Manhattan top. So you've got loads of options here, but the number one tip, something that I didn't do all the way through mine, and I wish I had, because it makes it much easier to work with difficult fabrics. I used starch. And I didn't think I needed it here, but for every beginner, for every intermediate sewer, I would really recommend that you starch your lightweight fabrics before you cut them out, because it will make your life so much easier. You're literally going to work on something that is as stiff as paper. It's easier to cut it out, you won't make a mistake, and it'll look really super.
And in this video I'm going to show you how to turn the bias binding to the outside, and on the inside of the garment you will just see one simple stitching line. It's a very nice way to do it. Alternatively, you can line the top. And in this example, I've used a silk velvet devoré, which is really nice. And you line it with a crepe de chine. That works beautifully. And because the top is bias cut, you will not have such an issue with stretch. I'm also going to show you how to do this beautiful shoulder here. Really slim and yet really easy. The first thing to do is to measure the scale on your pattern to check whether it's 5 centimeters or an inch. And once you've done that, you know it's printed off correctly, you can cut the whole lot out. What you'll notice in my patterns is that I have these attachment lines, and I use those to put the pieces together easier. They are all in alphabetical order, so it's very simple to do. You only got 2 pieces for this, which is very easy, and your bias binding. When you're cutting out, the best thing to do is to cut from the left and have your pattern on the right. Now we're also going to cut the bias binding, and what you're going to see is that you've already got that 45-degree angle on either side, which makes your bias binding a lot flatter. The first thing to do is to iron that bias binding lengthways in half, and as you can see here, the shiny side or the upper side of the fabric sits on the inside this time, because I really like to have the matte side to the outside when I work with satin. Press down everything you sew basically with your fabric weight. I'm using my fabric weight from Cottage Lane, and you can get that in my Amazon shop. The link for that is in the description below. And now you need to close your shoulder seams, and then we're also going to close that bias binding for the neckline. I use vertical pins because you don't have to necessarily take them out. You can, but you don't have to. It makes good sense when the back is a few millimeters wider, so you can easily ease the fabric in. Next, we're just going to overlock those edges, and then they're going to be ironed to the center back. But before we do, we're also going to sew together our bias binding. Foot width seam allowance is fair enough here. Then you want to iron the seams apart, cut them back, and then you're ready to go. Now I'm going to quarter both my binding and my front. And then I can align those markings And yeah, that's going to get it to come out perfect. So basically mark it in the four corners on your bias binding and then do exactly the same on your top. And what you will notice is that once you've marked the center back and the center front, that in fact the marking on the shoulder sits about 1 centimeter towards the front and not directly on the seam. So it's important to quarter it and not just go for the shoulder seam. We're going to pin our bias binding to the fabric underside, and then it's going to be rolled to the outside. Where the bias binding has the seam, you want to put that onto the back and then the other side to the front. Lift your front down a tiny little bit, so 4 millimeters or something like that, so that you just about catch it when you sew it, and it will make the V a lot smoother and not so round. Now I'm also going to put the bias binding onto the markings that we have on the shoulder. And that's it basically. Don't pin anymore. Try it without. It's way easier to do it like this. Put it under the sewing machine and line your presser foot up with the folded edge of your bias binding. Make sure that the fabric underneath it isn't stretched and really nice and flat. And your left hand kind of does that as you move around. The distance from the folded edge of your bias binding is way more important than the distance from the needle to the rough edge of the bias binding, because you're going to cut that back. So make sure that your foot is right on that folded edge. That will ensure you get the perfect width of the bias binding the whole way around. So we're going to sew all the way around basically, and left hand sorts it out and hold the bias in place. Make sure that the top doesn't slip out underneath your bias so that it's all edge to edge. You've got all the rough edges right on top of each other. And there we go. Make sure that the front actually has caught, and then cut back everything to about 3 millimeters. And then we're going to understitch it. And that means that we're going to sew the top to the bias binding this time. So roll down your bias binding like that. And then we're going to top stitch right in here. So we have one stitching line there. Make sure that you push the fabric apart, but don't pull on it at all, because every stitch line you do now is going to make your neckline firmer. So if anything, you might want to hold it in a bit by pushing it forwards and apart. So no pulling on it. And then the next step is to roll your bias binding over the rough edge and stitch it down, and you get this beautiful finish, which you will never get if you just put the shop bought bias binding on. Now then, what you want to do is sew right on the edge. You don't want to be miles in. Some people just do that. It is like 3 or 4 millimeters off. You might as well not bother, right? So stay on the very edge and extend your stitch length to 3 so that it doesn't look so homemade. So make sure that the fabric doesn't pull down in any area, that you keep moving it flat with your left hand and move the fabric around if you're in a curve, and then you sew it too. And now the other thing is that my eye goes from my needle back down to my fixed point on the presser foot, and the fixed point on the presser foot is right on that left side of my presser foot, the plastic, just in about 1 millimeter. That's my fixed point. And when I go around the curve, I just pull it ever so slightly over to the left in order to catch it just right. Then you want to iron your bias binding and use that tailor's clapper again to really get a beautiful finish. And we are ready for our side seams and the armhole. You could do French seams at this point, but I'm just going to do the really simple method of simply stitching it down 1 centimeter seam allowance, overlocking it or serging it, and finished. I think that's for a quick summer top just right. One thing to remember though is that this is similar to working with jersey. You need to stretch your seam while you go so that it won't break later if there's any tension on it, right? You want to take presser foot width only and stretch the fabric slightly. When you let go of the stretch, it will be exactly 1 centimeter, although it really doesn't matter if it's a little bit more or less. Important is to stretch the fabric. And then you serge the edge, and before you iron your seam to the center back, you want to iron in all that excess that you got through the stretching. Then we're going to iron our seam to the center back. You can use your fingers to pull the fabric apart a little bit, and you can see how that will make the fabric move up again as well, and for the seam to come closer together. Put the weight on and you're finished. Beautiful seam, very nice. Now I'm going to show you how to do the armholes. It really is a lot like what we've done on the neckline. So the first thing to do to your bias is to sew it together, obviously. The next step then is to iron the seam of the bias binding apart. And then we're going to cut back that seam allowance. And whenever a bias binding goes on, that's a really good idea because it'll make the whole binding sit so much flatter. Next, we're going to half the armhole binding. And then we're going to place it on the underarm seam and of course on the shoulder seam. And that's basically all we have to do here. It's very, very simple. Make sure that your presser foot sits directly on that edge, and then you go around. And now I can check the width. The right hand side was slimmer, so I had to unpick it again and then repin it and redo it. Now, had I pinned it from the start, I would have probably noticed this, but I mean, however you want to do this, if it's not quite right, unpick it and get it right, because it doesn't take you 5 minutes to do it at this stage, and it's not nice if it's uneven. Right, understitching again, this time of the armhole, same thing again. What you want to do is push the fabric forward nicely, pull it apart, but do not stretch it because you want all the extra firmness in the armhole as well to get that perfect finish that you can see on the model. And my model is actually the lovely owner. She's modeled that so well. I'm so glad that she loved all the tops. Anyway, let's get on here. We're now going to stitch it down, covering that cut back seam allowance again. And here we have a really nice close-up for you where you can see that as I come into the curve, no longer do I feed in that bias straight into the foot, but I slightly pull it over to the left hand side so that I will catch it. You want to be right on the edge, but you don't want to slip off either. And that takes a little bit of practice. Your eye will go from the needle to that fixed point all the time. Flick, 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 back and forwards to keep it right. And if you do it slow enough, then you should be absolutely fine. And it gives you such a beautiful neckline. I really, really love this. Right, done. Now I can admire my armhole and press it, and you could also use the tailor's clapper again. One thing I do as well is I press it flat on the shoulder and on the side seam so it looks like something that is from the shop. Otherwise you always have a slightly round part there over the shoulder, and I don't like that. Now the last step is to do the hem, and we're going to serge all the way around. And when you've done that, you're going to end up with a slightly wavery edge, obviously, which you need to steam in again before you turn your little hem up. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. We're going to turn the hem up, and then we're going to stitch right in that serger line there. And you could, of course, do a really nice narrow rolled edge hem, and I've got a video for that as well. but you don't have to. You can just turn it up like this. And look, I'm looking at my teeth, which are transporting the fabric, and I'm just on the side where they start. And when I line that up instead of the edge of the presser foot, I get that perfect stitch all the way around. All we need to do now is to press it and we're done.
I hope you enjoyed this and you're back for another project with Frocks and Frolics. Please visit the Frocks and Frolics Academy, where we've got lots of courses with the patterns to match, or free courses where you can just learn sewing. So I'll see you there. Bye for now.